Welcome back to the podcast, everyone. Today I am joined by Lisa Riegel, and we're going to be talking about neuroscience, brain science, education. We'll be delving into Lisa's past and history as it relates to this, and some gaps that we're trying to fill as it relates to education. So helpful for a lot of educators who are listening to this. So, Lisa, I'm really excited to delve into this with you. I was researching and looking a little bit about your past. You started in education, you have a PhD in education policy, and now you're doing the work that you're doing, which we'll get to in a moment. But I'm really fascinated by this transition between education and then getting a PhD in the policy of education. What was that for you? What was that inspiration? Decide I want to learn a little bit more about this as I start to grow myself professionally.
Sure. So I was a teacher for 9 years at a high school, and I always really loved the at-risk kids. So those were the ones that I taught, and that's where my heart was. And then I left teaching. I had a really great leader when I first started teaching, and then she left, and I had a series of really ineffective leaders. So it started making me really think about the system and then how leadership impacted that system. And then I moved into a leadership role myself and realized that it was just as bad at that level. And so when I had the opportunity to go to Ohio State, I studied leadership, but I was really interested in the human side because I think that we're taught a lot about the structure and org theory and all that kind of stuff. And even teacher training is about classroom management and curriculum and lesson planning. But we're missing this whole area of the human system within education. So that's what I started studying. And I was studying a lot of the social science research around motivation and engagement, adult learning, all of that type of stuff. And then I actually became a mother and my son had ADHD. So I was like, okay, I got to figure out what this is. So I started actually diving into the science and the neuroscience of the brain, and all of it kind of came together. And I was like, real change starts in the brain and we don't even understand how it works. And then the science of reading came along and people started connecting how we teach reading with how the brain learns to read, which we've known for 2 decades, but it was the first time educators had that information. And I thought, I get called in because I love at-risk kids. I get called in a lot to help with interventions and what do we do and how do we set up a system for a kid that isn't the neurotypical kid or a kid who comes from a lot of trauma. And so I started thinking about, well, that's in the brain too. The brain is dictating our behavior. So if I can bridge that gap for folks, then I think we can do a better job of setting up our school systems so that all kids can thrive versus just the ones that are ready to comply and commit to the practices that the school's asking for.
It's interesting because my background started in special education. So I taught special ed before I came to the US. And so I think that was equally a feeling of my draw was the way that the school system is set up is really not for anyone that doesn't conform to maybe neurotypical mindsets. And the way that I was taught, because I have a degree in education, and I reflect equally that teacher training really did not set me up to interact with students. It was kind of surprising of what we were learning. The mechanics of what we were learning was very regimented and rules based, but it didn't work on the interpersonal. It didn't work on the individual. And so
Right.
when you're struck as an educator, especially when you're new, and then you interact with people that are not conforming to the neurotypical, then you're hit with this wall of what do I do now? How do I move this forward? And I'm fascinated still that when I go to schools and teach educators on experiential education, that there really isn't this gap between what is taught and the reality of the work. There feels like there's almost a miss there. And it's also fascinating that you found that also in your own children or your own child with having to reckon with that. What did you notice as some of the bigger gaps that you were realizing that you were trying to fill between the way that we educate our students?
So I think the biggest gap that we have right now is that we lack a purpose. So when you think about education originally, the purpose was content transmission. And that was when it was like liberal arts and know a little bit about a lot of things and you'll be educated. But information's democratized now. So anybody can find it anywhere they want. And then with AI, that's even accelerating even more. So our system is still measuring content transmission. But content transmission isn't what's going to prepare kids for their futures. So then we moved to career readiness, and we started all these career pathway planning and all the, credentialing. And I just read somewhere the other day that 60% of the jobs, not new jobs, but all jobs, 60% of the jobs within 10 years don't exist right now because AI is disrupting the workplace and how people work. And that's kind of not a purpose anymore because there's not a single person who can tell you what the pathway is to a certain career because we don't know what that's going to look like. So I feel like we kind of lack a purpose at this point, and we hang on to the content transmission and career development. But what I would argue is what we really need to do is we need to focus on developing the brain, developing the thinking skills, filling that gap between what AI can do and what a human can do, as opposed to trying to train our kids to do content regurgitation, which AI will always do better than we will. And so I think we're in this really exciting and also very scary time that the system itself is going to be obsolete if it doesn't figure out how to align a purpose. And, everybody talks about student engagement and absenteeism. And I read something a couple weeks ago that said we don't have an engagement problem, we have a relevance problem. Students don't see the relevance in what they're doing. And I get that, because if I, as an adult, if I'm sitting and listening to somebody, even if I find it remotely interesting, if I'm like, this is not relevant at all to my life, I tune out. So I think that's the big challenge. And then I think the other challenge is that kids today are different. And so I talk a lot in my book about behavior, whether it's yours or mine or kids, it doesn't matter how old you are. It's the intersection of your biology and your context. And kids are growing up in a very different context, and our context can actually shape our brain, shapes the biology within our brain. And so teachers are trying to teach the child of 15 years ago that came with a very different context and very different biology, and they're struggling. And so that's what I really try to talk about is we need to recognize changing brains and changing student interests and relevancy. And when we look at that and we align our system to that, we're going to have happier, healthier kids.
That gap that you referenced between um, the context of the child of today versus the child of yesterday. I was actually reflecting on this recently with someone that I was talking to some students about the 90s, and a kid said to me, "Oh, it's so old," and I was struggling to think about that. But then I was reminded that the difference between 2026 and 1990 is the same between 1990 and 1950. But
Yeah,
the gap between what happened, the change and development of things in from 1990 to 1950 was actually shorter when you think of technology and changes in behavior than 1990 to 2026.
right.
Even though they're the same number of years, the rapid change in technology means that we're constantly playing catch up to what is absolutely what you say is relevant.
Yeah.
How do we maybe how do we maybe bridge that gap between that relevancy? Because as I'm hearing this, I'm like, wow, you're absolutely right. Like, students aren't seeing what the purpose is. Why am I doing the things you're asking me to do?
Right, right. And I think one of the things that I talk a lot about is how we form perceptions. So like how context actually does shape the brain, because I think people downplay that. So if you think about just a quick sort of science lesson, the way that our brain makes a perception is we have a area called the thalamus, and I call it the data manager. I named mine Harold. So Harold is my little data manager in my brain. He is in the limbic system, which means unconscious thinking. 80% of the traffic in our brain and the thinking is happening below our nose, which is unconscious to the thinking part of us. So there's a whole lot of stuff going on that we're not aware of. So Harold's job is to look at what's going on in the environment and then make sensory associations. And he doesn't have access to our full memories. We think of memories like a library. You go pull the file out and read about your memory, but memories are actually fragmented and stored in multiple locations. So when we want to make a meaningful memory, we have to tell our brain to go find all kinds of information, and then the smart part of our brain makes sense of it. So Harold only has access to these sensory associations, and what he does he goes into this sensory association bank and he pulls things where he says this is kind of like that, because if every single thing we had happen to us was totally novel, our brain would explode. So we look for patterns of, and so he goes in and he finds these associations. And then if you think of like reality like a banana, and all these sensory associations, like a series of filters or screens. If I take a banana and shove it through those filters, it doesn't look like a banana anymore. So our perceptions are never accurate to what's actually going on, which is why you and I can go somewhere, have the exact same event, but a wildly different experience because of the way Harold is associating what's going on. Well, those folders are formed through context, through repetition, experience, emotion, lived experiences. And when you think about like back in the 90s, when I was growing up, I watched The Love Boat and Little House on the Prairie and Happy Days and shows that were about community and people and, forgiveness and doing the right thing. And those became a worldview that became a filter. So if I'm in a situation and I see someone, my Harold says, people are generally kind, so you don't have to be scared, right? In today's media, kids are like, hey, Phil, you and I are going to manipulate her and vote her off the island. It's all about power and manipulation and othering and winning. And that becomes a lived viewpoint for kids. And so then they see people and their herald says, they could be dangerous. Don't trust them, right? And then you think of social media and the risk reward on social media. I can change my profile picture to a flag and get 4,000 dopamine hits from people as they like my virtue signaling. But in real space, if you fall down or if somebody's being mean to you and I step in to help, that's a huge risk. And it's a low reward because I get one dopamine hit. And so kids are not interacting in altruistic ways. They're not seeing altruism in the media. They're not experiencing it with social media. And then we have over parenting. They don't have unstructured time, so they don't learn to be creative and to resolve conflict. We don't have family dinners the way we used to. Everybody's so busy. So kids aren't learning the rhythm of conversation. So all of these things in their context are impacting both those filters and also their executive functioning skills as far as their impulse control, emotional regulation, information processing, all of those pieces and parts. And then, on top of that, the other thing that I think is scary is the medical industry just loves to diagnose everybody. And so the moment a child is uncomfortable, they go to the doctor. The doctor says, well, you have anxiety or you have depression. Here's a pill. Or you have ADD, which a lot of kids do, but a lot of kids have just low executive functioning because of our lived experiences. And so I think that is a real gap for educators to understand, because if they understand the biology and they have a child that's either disengaged or acting out, the first thing to recognize is that the reason that they are dysregulated may have nothing to do with what's actually happening. It has to do with how Harold is taking whatever it is in the environment and associating it with something that stresses them out or that their brain is saying this is dangerous. So I think understanding that can help people develop a little bit of empathy. And then the context that we create in our schools, what I want to see is just this protective bubble. When you walk in this school, you get dopamine hits all day. We're positive, we help each other. We're always using positive language so that Harold is inundated with positive filters within that context. And I always say the solution to pollution is dilution, right? So if we have a whole bunch of negative filters in our sensory memories, then the only way to combat those, we can't get rid of them because they happened, but we can add more and more and more positive filters so that our brain doesn't respond with a stress reaction.
As we listen to this, and as people are listening to this, it can feel dire. I think like, oh my, can feel an overwhelm. And I think that sometimes when, and I know this because I come in and do PD days for educators, there's a sense sometimes of like, oh, is this the next new thing that I have to try to add to my plate? And that can feel that kind of like level of overwhelm. And yet, what I sometimes describe is that as an experienced educator, what I'm doing is trying to create an experience that can maximize learning. I want to try to create an environment, and you sort of said that, the context, the environment that can maximize that. And it doesn't have to be in a massive way, but it could be these small moments. What is, if educators are listening to this, what is something that they could do on a very short-term level, or maybe an immediate actionable thing that you think that could change some of that context? Is it simply just role modeling empathy as an educator more, or what does it require for us to maybe change that, to bridge that gap?
Yeah, so some of it is, it's like putting the oxygen mask on yourself. Teachers are not regulated right now. They're overly stressed, they're burning out, they're in a system where it feels like it's constantly one more thing being thrown at them. So I think there's one solution to help the staff be healthy and happy and ready to teach is a leadership problem. And so like I have a book called Aspirations to Operations. We do a lot of dreaming about, even thinking about experiential education. We're going to bring this guy in. He's going to tell you all about experiential education, how great it is. So you go in there, you show them all kinds of cool things they can do, and they walk out overwhelmed because the leaders haven't set the stage for here's the desired state we want, and here's how we can help you get there. So I think that's one big problem. But there's a lot of things teachers can do that are super easy in their classroom that can help with context. And one is infuse positivity into your routines. So, a neuro well culture is safe, supportive, and proactive. So, safety is not just physical safety, it's emotional and intellectual safety. So, one thing I talk about with teachers is thinking about morning work. Like, I think the worst thing that ever happened in education is bell to bell teaching. Our brains are not set up for that. They're just not. And so, we are bringing kids in, we're throwing work in front of them right away. A lot of those kids we already know can't do that work. They're behind. And we just put it down and we say, here's some work that I know you can't do. So sit here, you watch everybody else who can do it and just kind of sit here and feel dumb and welcome to school. And then the kids are elevated and they disengage because they don't have that sense of expectancy that they're going to succeed. So one easy thing to do is decouple content from skills. So start the kids out with some morning work where they write about a weekend, write about something that they love. Tell me two good things about yourself that you love and why. Give them something that they can access the content, and then you can still grade the writing. You can still have, it attached to academic standards. But when we jump right into morning work that is highly content focused, it shuts down a lot of kids. So one of the things I talk about with teachers, and this is actually so easy to do. And I've got right now, just this past spring, I've had 50 educators that I have worked with, and 50 out of 50 have said this has been an amazing tactic that has changed things. So what you do is you divide your class into learning sprints. And so it's like if you and I went to the gym and got on a treadmill and said, we're going to run for a half hour, and we're running and running. And we look down, we've like, got to be almost at a half hour. And we look down, it's been 7 minutes. And we're like, I'm never going to make it. Right. The school day for a kid is like a treadmill with a never ending, just we're never going to be finished. So taking your class and saying, okay, we're going to do a 10-minute learning sprint and tell them what you're going to do. I'm going to talk to you for a minute. So I need eyes on me, ears open. And then I'm going to give you some time with a partner or by yourself or whatever you're doing. You set a timer and you put that timer up on the board and so that everybody can see it. And then that way, if I'm a kid and I'm working on math problems or something and I'm like, oh man, I'm running out of steam. And I look up and I'm like, oh, I only have 2 minutes left. I can do this for 2 minutes, right? So it teaches them how to have sustained focus for that period of time. Once the timer goes off, you do a brain break. And the brain break is a great opportunity to infuse positivity. So you could have a brain break where you say, hey, turn to your neighbors and tell them two things you're really proud of. Or what's one great thing that happened today? Or, make a plan to do something kind for somebody later today. Or just infusing, because what happens is that back to Harold, if Harold's expected to look for positive things, he will see them. So they did a study once where the participants had to count how many times somebody made a basket in basketball. And so they had that going on. The researchers turn it off, say, how many times did the person make a basket? And they tell them. And then they say, did you see the giant gorilla that walked across the court? And most people didn't see it. They weren't primed to see it. So we have a lot of beautiful, kind, wonderful gorillas walking around that nobody's noticing. And so even just doing some little stop and thinks with kids to just, first of all, focus their attention span and then use that break time as a way to promote positivity and to kind of prime Harold to look for the good things in the environment. And then you go to your next learning sprint and, you just kind of chunk the day that way. And what I found is that the teachers who are using it, like I had a kindergarten teacher who was like, as soon as I say, she said after like 3 days, as soon as I say we're doing a learning sprint, all the kids are like, okay, let's go. And they compliment each other, like, look how much you got done in this period. So it's teaching that executive function that we don't have because of the way we live. it's teaching them how to focus, how to shift focus, how to come back. It teaches them time management of like, how long is 10 minutes? And what can I accomplish in 10 minutes when I put my mind to it? So it can help reduce stress in the students, and they know they get that little time, and it's a great opportunity to build relationships with kids and get to know them in a different light. Because I feel like one of the things with the content transmission we've done, we measure that. We still measure that through our assessments. And when we started tying student outcome data to teacher quality, teachers moved from I teach kids about English or about history to I teach content to kids. And now the kid who isn't compliant, moving along at the same pace, isn't a puzzle to be solved. They're a problem to overcome because they're screwing up my data. And so by breaking into these learning sprints and giving yourself some of these little times to sort of bring the focus back to I teach kids, it can be really powerful. And the teachers that have used it, and I've used it all the way from kindergarten through high school. I've even used it. I work with a school for incarcerated boys. It works everywhere. And the teachers, when they start talking about it, are smiling and like, oh, we had so much fun on this. And the kids are getting stuff done. And it's not a constant battle all day long for their attention.
It's interesting as well as you reflect, it's like beneficial to the students, but the thing that I get more excited about is it's beneficial for the teachers. Like as we talk about role modeling a behavior that we hope to see, then if an educator is excited to start teaching again, or
Yeah.
what an impact that has on their students. I think we can all probably think back to teachers that we had as kids that stand out. And they were normally the ones that looked like they were having the most fun doing the work.
Yeah.
And the ones that we were like, oh, they're the worst were the people who were just checking a box
Yeah.
because they'd lost that kind of passion and energy. And
Yeah.
that's almost a reframe. I'm going to ask you kind of a bigger question, maybe like just an education in general. How do we rectify what I observe is a lack of support for educational systems? We're talking obviously US focused, but I interact with people across the world and it seems similar. We've lost some of the support that educators are getting because it feels like it's beyond how does the educator do systems that can make themselves feel more valued. But I just sense that there feels like a lack of value to education in general.
Yeah.
What's your
Well,
thoughts on that, and how do you see the change there?
yeah, I think that the reason that we're losing faith in the education system is because the system doesn't have a purpose. And people are recognizing that. And I think COVID really opened a lot of parents' eyes to that as they watched just the never ending, complete and turn in worksheets and just, the low level kind of recall stuff that was happening. And so I think, to fix that, we need to really have some conversations about what is our purpose. And a lot of schools do that, like portrait of a learner or portrait of a graduate kind of stuff. And if you look at what they write all the stuff that we're not teaching, right? They write about being a good citizen and being kind and having empathy and being able to resolve conflict and do all these things. And so when I work with schools, I always say, okay, let's start there. Because in the same way we have a scope and sequence for teaching algebra or for teaching geometry or geography, we should have a scope and sequence for how are we providing experiences? How are we defining these skills? I've got a couple schools I'm working with right now, and I asked the high school team, define the skills that students need post AI. And all the skills they came up with were these skills, right? The human skills, the executive function skills. And I said, okay, well, let's take critical thinking first. Because if you look at data like MAP score data or STAR data or things, often it's that extended thinking where students dip. And that's the thinking stuff. And so I said, let's define critical thinking. So in a 2-hour late arrival day, they couldn't come up with the shared definition of critical thinking. So I'm like, so we complain about kids can't think and kids can't socially engage, and we complain about all these things. But if we don't have words to describe what we see and hear, if they're doing it, then we're never going to be able to teach it. We're not going to be able to reinforce it. So I think if schools can start to focus more on the thinking skills, the process versus the product, that makes a big difference. And it's a scary shift because then we're measured on the content. we're measured on the product and not the process. So I think there needs to be, from a policy level, some serious pushback on, and I'm not an anti-accountability person. I think it's, if you don't measure it, it doesn't matter. But I think that we have moved the purpose of school to we need to improve test scores versus the purpose of school to we need to help kids be ready for life. Not aligned at all.
I was interviewing an educational historian from Boston, and he kind of reframed the mindset that I have on like public school education. He actually referred to it as, rather than traditional education, as industrialized education. Because if you think about the bells that you've suggested, like everything was setting up to get students prepared for an industrial age where they'd have to listen to the bells. There was organization, rows, systems, very robotic, factory based. And we are not there anymore. We have got a huge misalignment between the way that we educate and the real world. And that misalignment is deteriorating so many factors of it. And I think that everything you've suggested, it's the lack of purpose. Like, why am I doing this? What is this for? I even have, and my daughter, she's 10, and I said, how was school? And she said, oh, I think school's kind of boring. And I'm like, she's 10.
Yeah.
It hurts me to know that my daughter is finding school boring at 10. Like, I found it boring when I was at high school, sure, but I was a teenager going through a lot of stuff then. But as a 10-year-old who should still be really at that formative excitement age of learning, there's obviously a lack of purpose to what is
Yeah.
happening in the day. And that I
Well,
find is sad.
yeah, and I was at a school after the first week of school, a little kindergarten boy came out and I was standing with the principal, and the principal said, "How was your first week at school?" And he dead-eyed her and said, "If you assess me one more time, I'm not coming back." And I
Wow.
was like, "Wow."
Yeah.
And
Doesn't that
that's what
say
we're doing.
everything?
We had assessments when we were kids. I mean, I remember I took
Yeah.
like the California and the Iowas and stuff. And, you would show up and the teacher would be like, okay, we're going to have a test today. And everybody'd be like, okay. And we'd take the test and then we'd move on. And now it's like they have assemblies. I mean, it's so much where the kids feel like I am a statistic. I'm not a person. And there have been
Yes.
several national studies done about student perceptions of learning. And the really sad conclusion to these studies that's been pretty consistent, students believe I go to school to get credentialed, I learn outside of school. And that is not what we want. But that's what we've set up because that's what we pay attention to.
Yeah, and it is a reality of the pedagogy that I work within was created and is vibrant because of the lack of that in the school environment. And so I always have to reckon with the fact that I'm coming into schools, and were it not for the fact that schools were lacking in this area, I wouldn't really be having to come in and teach this. And so it's it's evident that you're going to continue to find niche, pseudo, whatever forms of micro. I was describing this as like micro niching of education. You're going to have this micro niching where everyone's doing their own things because we're trying to figure out how to fill the gaps that the environment is currently not fulfilling. And I want to put it out there that I work with so many educators, and the educators are not the issue.
No.
Educators are wonderful, and they are identifying everything you're saying and I'm saying. They
Yeah.
all say the same.
Yeah.
There's a system flaw and a mindset on traditionalism that this phrase I always use is the critic is the greatest optimist, and I sometimes find that critics are seen as negative. But a critic actually cares. That's the reason they're critiquing something. They're
I
optimistic of what
love that.
could happen
I love
rather
that.
than being negative. So the critic
Yeah.
is the greatest optimist. And actually, apathy is the thing that we should try to hopefully get rid of. Apathy
Yeah.
is a lack of caring. A system is good. It's fine. I hear sometimes like this was how it was when I was a kid. But was it good when you were a kid? No. Like that kind of, and it does take energy, and it takes people like yourself who are also coming up with new strategies and saying like there is a different system and a different way to be able to operate.
Right.
I want to put it
No.
out there as some level of gratitude to you and the work you're doing.
Yeah, well, thank you. Yeah, and I really try with because I'm in schools all the time, so I get the day to day. So I think sometimes when people come out with here's the whole new model of how we do things, it's too big a leap, right? So we want to think about how do we incrementally make change. So one of the things I talk about in aspirations to operations, which is for school leaders, is like, okay, what's your desired state? So maybe the desired state is a true morphing of experiential education and content. And, you've got this big dream of what it looks like. Well, if I'm currently teaching whole group instruction 90% of my day, that is a huge chasm between the current state and the desired state. So we have to build kind of stepping stones along the way. So like even in the book Neurowell, where I talk about creating this culture, I try to frame it as this isn't an initiative. It's a pair of glasses that are informed by the brain and what we know about behavior and academic and social behaviors. And it's a way to simply apply that lens to the work you do. So like the learning sprints, you don't have to change it. You don't have to go to a million days of PD on it. It's just a little incremental step. It's like a step one, right? And then you kind of stair step your way to a school that's truly functioning in a different way. And I've worked with a couple schools that are with at-risk kids and really ready for like massive transformation. And so we started with some of the little, easy to implement things so teachers could start to feel some success, see that it wasn't as scary as they thought, that the kids actually did better, because I think there's this sense of if I relinquish any control at all, it'll be mayhem. And the reality is, if you relinquish a little control and you share that power with the kids actually value what they're doing more. But I worked with a school that got to the desired state. But what it meant was we blew up the whole thing. Kids don't have class periods. There's no bells. They go in pods. They're mastery based learning, all of these different kinds of techniques. But it took us a long time to get there. So I think some things too are how do you see the desired state? And I would argue that you should have purpose. Like purpose is the North Star. What is our actual purpose here? And then start to think about incremental changes that you can do that will keep teachers feeling safe. Because when teachers are feeling overwhelmed, they can't think. And so they're not able to be creative and figure out how to put things in place because it's just too much and they're overwhelmed. And so it really is a leadership and systems problem, not a teacher problem, because they will
Mhm.
do whatever it takes, but then they're not allowed to do certain things. I talk about coherence sometimes. I was working with a school that wanted to do universal design for learning, and then their curriculum department bought direct instruction curriculum. So I'm like, so your teachers are going to fail no matter what they do, right? Those two things don't work together. So you've got to be able to say, okay, use the curriculum here, and then here's where you use this. You've got to get from the 30,000 foot to the 3 foot view to help teachers understand how to use these materials that you throw at them.
And that's, I think, probably where some of the overwhelm is, like the aspiration. Where's the aim? Where's the goal? The goal is too far, so I'm not going to reach it. It's the same thing as like the treadmill mindset. So it's
Yes.
taking your sprinting model that you've talked about, learning sprint, and also applying it to the way that we maybe add in ideas into a school system. It cannot be. I think it was like, how do you eat an elephant? Or it's like one bite at a time. It's like you've got to you've got to do something small before you try to go too far and lead
Right.
too far.
Well, and even thinking
What?
about the way we
Yeah.
do professional development. I mean, 3 times a year, you're sitting there all day, 8 hours being fire hosed with information, and then the leader says, "Oh, they're trained." And it's like, "No, they're
They
not.
are.
They've
Absolutely.
listened, maybe half listened because it was just a constant flow of information." So how are we using like collaborative time and teacher meetings and staff meetings? How are we dripping a little bit of learning and support through all of that with a clear purpose of where we're going? Because what right now it's kind of like a boat, right? Everybody's rowing like crazy, but they're all rowing in slightly different directions, so we're not moving. So we need to have like a clear purpose of where are we headed and then how do we get there and get everybody rowing in the same direction so that and there's a great book if anybody wants to read a great book this spring. It's called The Boys on the Boat, and it's about the 1940s crew team that won a gold medal. And they talk about how every person in that boat became a single organism because they were working in sync. And each person had a little bit different role, but they call it catching a craw when you like aren't rowing evenly. But when you get into swing where everybody is rowing as one organism, you row slower and the boat goes faster. And that's what we need in education. Because right now we've got people rowing like crazy and they're exhausted. And some people think we're headed over here, and some people think we're headed over here, and we're moving nowhere.
Well, that feels, Lisa, like a mic drop moment of an end of a podcast. So I want to thank you for that. I'm lastly just going to refer listeners back to the books that you've written, Aspirations to Operations and Neurowell. You've got other stuff coming up as well. Where might people find information about yourself so that if they are inspired, as I hope people are, that they can research more about you, Lisa?
Yeah, so I can give you my website addresses so you can put them in the notes. And then I'm on LinkedIn. And so connect with me on LinkedIn, message me. If schools are looking for somebody to come out and do some keynotes or some workshops, I take 5 or 6 schools a year that really are ready for transformation and I go deep dive with them. But I'm selective about that because you have to be really ready to change and say, okay, we're gonna do this. We're not gonna, you know, just try to muddle around in it a little bit. And those are really fun to go deeper. So I welcome any kind of conversation with folks. I hope they'll enjoy the books. And especially if there's a school leader listening, the aspirations to operations can really help you understand why you're stuck and how, and it's operational. How do you get out of this just constant hamster wheel of initiatives and burnout and a new initiative and more posters and
Well, thank you, Lisa. I will throw all the links into the description. And please, if you're listening, take Lisa up on the option to reach out. I often say that to people. When people say that, they mean it. So please do it. And we appreciate it also. And once again, just acknowledgement of your work and appreciation for the work you're doing, Lisa. So thank you so much.
thank you for having me.